People often say that marriage is a vow to stand by each other in sickness and in health. But to Julian Vance, my husband, marriage was nothing more than a financial statement. The day I held the lab results diagnosing me with a severe autoimmune disease, requiring at least 6 months of treatment and rest, officially became a bad debt in his eyes. I stepped into our lavish glass-walled penthouse, where Julian was casually sipping wine while overseeing his real estate empire of 14,000 rental units. I was looking for an embrace, a single word of comfort, but all I received was a cold, calculating stare. "You used to be a good partner," he said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "But now, you're a burden. A negative yield investment. I didn't build this to build empire to sustain things that no longer generate value." That wasn't a complaint. It was a death sentence. In that exact moment, I realized I was about to be crushed by the ruthless machine my own husband had built. The days following my diagnosis didn't bring breakfast in bed, hushed tones of comfort, or a husband holding my hand by the bedside. Instead, they brought an echoing, suffocating silence. To understand how my marriage dissolved into a corporate transaction, you have to understand the world Julian built. We lived in a glass-walled penthouse on Lakeshore Drive that felt more like a museum than a home. It featured Italian marble countertops that had never seen a home-cooked meal, a Putnam cellar holding hundreds of expensive bottles, and a dining table that seated 14, yet was almost always empty. Julian's empire spanned 14,000 rental units. He was a man who worshipped efficiency over empathy. He often bragged to his board members that he had never walked the hallway of a building he owned, never stood inside a unit, and never met a single tenant. In his eyes, that was the ultimate mark of success. Tenants were not names in Julian's world. They were simply some numbers on a spreadsheet, line items that either performed or didn't. If they couldn't pay, he believed they had simply made bad choices, and that wasn't his problem to solve. Everything in his business was managed by third-party firms and automated software, professional, efficient, and entirely distant. What I hadn't fully grasped, until the fatigue of my illness settled deep into my bones, was that he managed our marriage with the exact same software in his mind. I was the polished, accomplished wife, an asset that looked good at charity galas and investor dinners. But the moment my autoimmune disease flared, stripping me of my energy and demanding actual care, my stock plummeted. Sentiment, as Julian's late father had taught him, was a luxury landlords couldn't afford. The moment you started seeing people as human beings instead of contracts, you had already lost. Julian applied that ruthless gospel to me. I was no longer a performing asset. I was a liability. The purge was breathtaking in its speed and brutality. I barely had the strength to get out of bed without my joints screaming in agony. Yet Julian wasted no time. He didn't even have the basic decency to sit me down and look me in the eye. He simply filed for divorce and handed the reins of my destruction over to his lead counsel, Silas Croft. Silas was a man who smiled with his teeth but never his eyes, a corporate shark who lived for the thrill of the financial kill. Within 48 hours of Julian walking out the door, the financial freeze began. I went to the pharmacy to pick up the expensive immunosuppressants my doctor had prescribed, only to have the pharmacist hand my credit card back with a sympathetic wince. Declined. I checked my phone, locked out of the joint accounts. I called my private banker, only to be read a sterile legal script about pending litigation and frozen assets. Julian hadn't just left me, he had strategically cut my supply lines. He and Silas weaponized the legal system to bleed me dry, knowing full well that a woman fighting a debilitating illness wouldn't have the stamina to fight a protracted legal war. They wanted me desperate. They wanted me to settle for pennies just to survive. But Julian's cruelty didn't stop at the bank. He wanted to make sure I understood exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. To escape the oppressive, echoing silence of the penthouse, I had temporarily relocated to a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town to recover in peace. It was a quiet unit in a mid-rise building, one of the 14,000 doors that Julian's company owned. I thought I would be safe there. I thought naively that even Julian wouldn't stoop to throwing his sick wife into the street. I forgot about the system. Julian had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building a master database that tracked every lease, every payment, and every filing across his empire with 0 exceptions. He had deliberately designed his business to insulate himself from the human consequences of his decisions. He didn't need to personally kick me out. He just let his beloved machine do what it was programmed to do. Because my assets were frozen by his lawyer, the rent payment for the apartment failed to process. On the 6th day of the month, the automated late fee was applied. I tried calling the management office, leaving voicemails, explaining that I was the CEO, that there was a legal hold, that I just needed a grace period. Nobody returned my calls. The system didn't have a button for compassion, a button for context, or even a button for a wife. It only had a button for eviction. The notices arrived like clockwork, slipped under my door by faceless property managers. Non-payment. Eviction filed. I watched the timeline unfold exactly as Julian engineered it. Thousands of poor families, from a missed payment to an executed eviction in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks to erase a life. The peak of his cold-bloodedness arrived on a biting Tuesday morning. I was running a low-grade fever, my body aching with every breath when the knock came. It wasn't Julian. It was the marshals. Julian had let the automated protocol run its course without lifting a single finger to intervene. He sat in his glass tower, sipping his expensive Burgundy, while the woman he had vowed to cherish was escorted out of her home. I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, shivering in a thin coat, surrounded by a few hastily packed garbage bags holding whatever clothes and essentials I could grab. My chest tightened, not just from the illness, but from the staggering, suffocating weight of the betrayal. I was looking at the very bottom of the empire my husband had built, the crushed, discarded human collateral he never had to look at. But as I stood there, feeling the icy wind bite through my clothes, something inside me snapped. The tears dried up before they could even fall. The panic hardened into something solid, cold, and razor-sharp. Julian thought he had thrown out a broken machine part. He didn't realize he had just forged a blade. When the person who once shared your bed turns you into a worthless number on a spreadsheet, you are faced with a stark choice. Do you collapse under the weight of their cruelty? Or do you sharpen yourself on the stone of their betrayal? If you have ever been hurt, discarded, or underestimated by someone's cold-bloodedness, hit subscribe right now. Because my tears ended on that sidewalk, and the next chapter is the blueprint of my counterattack. The cold in February doesn't just chill your skin, it settles deep into your bones, sinking into places that a coat can never reach. For a woman whose body is already waging a violent war against itself through a severe autoimmune disease, that kind of cold feels like shards of broken glass grinding in every joint. I stood on the frozen concrete sidewalk, shivering in a thin coat, and stared at the scattered remnants of my life. They had piled everything I owned on the curb like useless debris after a violent storm. My necessary medications, a few cherished books, and the few clothes I had managed to grab were stuffed carelessly into splitting black garbage bags leaning against a rusted fire hydrant. I looked up at the building. It was 5 stories of graying brick with rusted fire escapes. It belonged to Julian's massive portfolio. I belonged to the street. It was staggering to comprehend the sheer velocity of my fall. A mere month and a half ago, I was the wife of a billionaire CEO, sleeping on high-thread count sheets in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Now, I was just another disposable statistic. I had witnessed firsthand exactly how efficient my husband's ruthless machine truly was. From the moment the automated system flagged my missed payment to the day the marshals physically removed me from the premises, it had taken exactly 6 weeks. 6 short weeks to completely erase my dignity, my safety, and my nearly 5-year track record of being a perfect, reliable partner. I was a black woman standing in the freezing wind, stripped of her identity and her health, discarded by a man who viewed human beings as nothing more than line items on a spreadsheet. In the agonizing days leading up to the eviction, I hadn't just sat back and waited for the axe to fall. I had fought. I had desperately tried to reason with the very machine I used to defend at high society charity dinners. I remember sitting in the sterile waiting room of Julian's third-party property management company. I had called their office no less than 11 times, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails, practically begging for a grace period, a simple extension, or even just the basic dignity of a human conversation. None of my calls were ever returned. Driven by desperation and the throbbing ache of my inflamed joints, I walked into their office and sat in that lobby for 2 solid hours. I watched the clock tick. I watched well-dressed agents walk past me, their eyes sliding over me as if I were a ghost. Nobody came out to meet with me. Nobody offered a payment plan, and nobody cared that my assets were locked in a vicious legal freeze. I realized then, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that Julian's system didn't have a button for compassion. It only had a button for eviction. It was meticulously designed to process people quickly, quietly, and efficiently. I wasn't Mrs. Vance to them. I was a non-responsive unit, a liability scheduled for turnover and market rate relisting. When you are stripped of your wealth and your title, you quickly learn how invisible you become in America. I knew the math behind my destruction because I had heard Julian boast about it. On day 6 of a missed payment, the system automatically applied a late fee of $75 per day. Within a month, a tenant wouldn't just owe rent. They would owe an insurmountable mountain of fees, a hole almost impossible to climb out of. I had watched my husband build this $2.6 billion fortress of automated policies to protect his portfolio, ensuring he never had to look a renter in the eye and ask if the heat worked or if they were safe. Now, the heavy iron gates of that fortress had been slammed in my face. I was locked on the outside, pounding my bleeding fists against the glass while the machine hummed along perfectly. With my bank accounts frozen by Silas Croft and my credit instantly destroyed by the eviction filing, standard hotels were entirely out of the question. An eviction stays on your record for 7 years, guaranteeing that almost no landlord will approve your next application. It is a cascade of ruin that starts with a single closed door. Exhausted, feverish, and out of options, a social worker directed me to an emergency women's shelter located in the basement of a church. Walking down those concrete stairs was a descent into a reality I had previously only seen on the evening news. The room was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, filled with folding tables, and lined with cots arranged in tight rows like a wartime field hospital. The air was thick, smelling of instant coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the heavy, undeniable scent of too many bodies crammed into too small a space. It was there, sitting on a thin gym mat and clutching a paper cup of lukewarm tea to soothe my shivering, that the true horrifying magnitude of Julian's sins finally came into focus. I wasn't the only one. I looked around the crowded basement and saw the human faces of Julian's efficiency. I saw black women, single mothers who had worked grueling double shifts just to keep their families housed, now sitting on the hard floor. I watched a 9-year-old girl standing near a cot, gripping her school backpack straps like they were the only solid, reliable things left in her shattered world. I saw a 5-year-old boy sitting on a garbage bag stuffed with clothes, looking up with wide, innocent eyes, asking his mother if they were camping. He asked that because children are forced to translate destruction into an adventure just to survive, a truth that is simply too large for a body that small. Listening to the hushed, tearful conversations in that room, my physical pain began to recede, replaced by a searing white-hot clarity. These women weren't deadbeats. They were certified nursing assistants who had paid their rent on time for nearly 5 years, only to lose their jobs to budget cuts. They had exactly 2 months of savings, and when that ran dry, they were thrown onto the sidewalk because the management company refused to answer the phone. They had done everything right, only to be crushed by a billionaire who firmly believed that the moment you saw a tenant as a person instead of a contract, you had already lost. Julian was profiting off their misery. He was extracting wealth from the most vulnerable, hard-work people in the city and tossing them into the trash the moment they stumbled. Sitting in that church basement, surrounded by the weeping collateral damage of my husband's massive empire, I made a choice. I could succumb to the autoimmune disease ravaging my body. I could let Silas Croft force me into a pitiful, meager settlement just so I could afford a cheap studio apartment and my monthly medications. I could easily fade away into the silent statistics of discarded, broken women. Or I could fight. I slowly wiped my eyes, feeling the feverish heat radiating from my skin. The tears I shed on that gym mat would be my absolute last. Julian Vance thought he had successfully eradicated a negative yield investment. He thought he had silenced a burden. He didn't realize that by throwing me into the gutter, he had given me the exact education I needed to destroy him. I knew his system inside and out. I knew his margins. And now, looking at the children sleeping on the floor around me, I knew his victims. I wouldn't just survive this illness. I would weaponize my survival. I would build something stronger, something built on the very humanity he despised, and I would use it to dismantle the 14 empire piece by piece. Sometimes, losing absolutely everything is the greatest gift you can receive because it leaves you with absolutely nothing left to fear. When the person who shared your bed turns you into a worthless number on a spreadsheet, do you collapse under the weight of their cruelty, or do you sharpen yourself on the stone of their betrayal? If you want to see how a penniless, chronically ill woman took down a ruthless billionaire's empire using his own rulebook, leave a comment below. My blueprint for vengeance was about to begin. There is a particular kind of clarity that only comes when you've survived the absolute worst thing you thought could happen to you. When you reach a certain age, You stop believing in fairy tales. But you never quite expect to find yourself shivering on a church basement floor, clutching your medical records like a shield. I spent my first month out on the street fighting a two-front war. One against the autoimmune disease ravaging my joints, and the other against the suffocating gravity of poverty. But anger is a spectacular painkiller. It fueled me when my medication ran low. It got me up from that thin gym mat every morning. I wasn't just going to survive Julian Vance's betrayal. I was going to dissect his empire, find its beating heart, and crush it in the palm of my hand. But you don't tear down a fortress with your bare hands. You need leverage, and you need an insider who knows where the foundation is cracked. I needed Evelyn Rossi. Evelyn was a brilliant financial advisor and asset manager who had once been a rising star in Chicago's commercial real estate sector. That is, until she crossed paths with Julian and his attack dog Silas Croft. 4 years ago, Evelyn had tried to blow the whistle on one of Julian's aggressive, borderline illegal property acquisitions. In response, Silas orchestrated a boardroom bloodbath that didn't just fire her, it blacklisted her. They dragged her name through the mud, buried her in frivolous litigation, and effectively exiled her from the industry she had dedicated her life to. I tracked Evelyn down to a cramped, dimly lit tax preparation storefront in Southside Chicago, where she was making $20 an hour helping gig workers file their returns. When I walked through the door, thinner, leaning heavily on a cane on my bad days, and wearing clothes I'd bought at a thrift store, she didn't recognize the polished billionaire's wife she had once seen in the financial columns. But when I spoke, she recognized the quiet, dangerous cadence of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I took her to a rundown diner across the street. Over bitter black coffee and a plate of cold toast, I laid it all out. I didn't ask for her pity. I asked for her vengeance. "Julian did it put him away, Evelyn," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "He threw me into the very machine that chewed you up. I know his network. I know his routines, but you know the math he hides from the board. You know where the bodies are buried." Evelyn studied me for a long time, tracing the rim of her coffee mug. Her eyes were hard, tempered by years of forced humiliation. "You're talking about taking down a man who owns the air you breathe in this city," she warned, her voice a low gravel. "Julian's portfolio is impenetrable. He's got 14,000 doors and an army of lawyers." "He has 14,000 blind spots," I corrected her. "Because he's never bothered to look behind a single one of those doors. We are going to build a ladder out of his arrogance. And when we reach the top, we are going to push him off." A slow, sharp smile spread across Evelyn's face. That afternoon, the alliance of the discarded was officially forged. We had to start from the absolute bottom. With Evelyn's remaining contacts and my relentless hustle, we managed to secure a few freelance property management contracts for independent slumlords in the city's neglected neighborhoods. It was grueling, unglamorous work. I was managing decaying 80-year-old walk-ups where the paint peeled like dead skin and the radiators hissed like angry snakes. I was the one walking the dark hallways, knocking on doors, and sitting at cheap laminate kitchen tables with tenants who were terrified of losing their homes. I saw the reality that Julian had spent his entire career insulating himself from. I met mothers who worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on, only to be threatened with eviction because their childcare fell through. I learned the names, the struggles, and the quiet dignities of the people my husband had proudly dismissed as non-responsive units. At night, long after my aching joints demanded rest, Evelyn and I would sit in her cramped apartment, huddled over laptops, crunching data. We pulled public eviction records. We analyzed housing court dockets. We combed through the financial filings of Julian's publicly traded holding company. I was searching for a vulnerability. I was looking for the crack in the 2-hour, $6 billion armor. It took 3 months of relentless digging, but it on a freezing November night, staring at a dizzying spreadsheet of eviction timelines, the numbers finally clicked into place. I saw the Achilles heel. It was so glaringly obvious yet utterly invisible to a man blinded by his own greed. Julian's entire business model was built on a foundational philosophy he had inherited from his ruthless father. Sentiment is a luxury, and margins are everything. For his company, eviction wasn't a last sort. It was a highly calculated business tool. The strategy was simple and brutal. Remove a tenant paying below market rate, renovate the unit with minimal upgrades, and relist it at a higher price. In Julian's mind, and in the eyes of his board, turnover wasn't a failure of the system, it was the system. But the spreadsheet in front of me told a drastically different story. Julian was looking at the gross potential rent of a turned-over unit, but he was completely ignoring the financial hemorrhage happening underneath the surface. Evelyn and I broke down the hidden costs of his ruthless efficiency. We tallied up the costs of turnover, the renovation between tenants, the legal fees, the court filings, the lost rent during vacancy, and the advertising for new renters. The numbers were staggering. When a family was evicted, it often took an average of 3 to 4 months to turn the unit, navigate the overloaded housing courts, pay Silas Croft's exorbitant legal fees, slap a cheap coat of paint on the walls, and find a new tenant willing to pay the inflated rate. During that entire period, the unit sat completely empty, generating zero revenue while consuming operational capital. Julian believed he was optimizing his empire by tossing struggling people onto the sidewalk. He thought he was trimming the fat. But the data proved that his cruelty was actually his largest overhead expense. His automated system was systematically bleeding his own profit margins dry. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes, and let out a breathless laugh. Evelyn looked up from her notes, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked. "He's wrong," I whispered, tapping the screen with a trembling finger. "Julian's entire philosophy is mathematically flawed." I turned the laptop so she could see the final column. The math was undeniable, written in stark, undeniable black and white. Keeping people in their homes was cheaper than throwing them out. If a landlord simply offered a struggling tenant a 60-day period, a modified payment plan, or a couple of $100s in emergency rent relief, they bypassed the massive crater of legal fees and vacancy losses. By treating tenants like human beings instead of disposable assets, the long-term yield of the property actually increased. Compassion wasn't a liability. Compassion was the most lucrative, untapped competitive advantage in the entire commercial real estate market. Julian's strength was his scale, but his fatal weakness was his profound lack of humanity. He had built a machine designed to punish, and that punishment carried a massive, invisible price tag. I looked at Evelyn, my heart hammering against my ribs, the fatigue of my illness momentarily forgotten. We didn't need to outspend Julian to destroy him. We just needed to outsmart him using the one variable his system could never account for: decency. "Evelyn," I said, my voice steady and resonant with newfound purpose, "we're not going to just manage other people's properties anymore. We are going to build our own fund. We are going to poach his investors, and we are going to do it by proving that his cruelty is costing them millions." The blueprint for Vanguard Haven was born that night. From the ashes of my ruined life, I had finally found the weapon that would bring my husband to his knees. Armed with the data Evelyn and I had pulled from the late-night ashes of my former life, it was time to move from theory to execution. We weren't just going to start a property management firm. We were going to build a sanctuary that doubled as a financial fortress. We named it Vanguard Haven. The name was a promise, of Vanguard leading the charge into a new era of real estate, and a haven for the people the current system treated as disposable. But a name and a philosophy don't buy apartment buildings. For that, we needed capital, and we needed it from the very people who usually funded men like my ex-husband, Julian. Pitching Vanguard Haven was the most grueling performance of my life. I was a 50-something black woman, still relying on a sleek silver-handled cane on the days my autoimmune disease flared up, walking into mahogany-paneled boardrooms filled with older white men who had spent their entire careers worshiping at the altar of ruthless capitalism. They looked at me with thinly veiled amusement, expecting a bitter ex-wife peddling a charity vanity project to soothe her wounded pride. Instead, I gave them a masterclass in unit economics. I didn't utter the word compassion once during those initial meetings. I knew their language, and I spoke it fluently. I slid our meticulously bound prospectuses across their polished tables and pointed directly to the gaping hole in the traditional property management model. I showed them exactly how much of their dividend was being incinerated by Julian's beloved turnover engine. I broke down the exorbitant legal retainers paid to corporate shits like Silas Croft, the compounding losses of vacant units, and the inflated contractor fees for slapdash renovations. "I am not here to appeal to your morality, gentlemen," I told a room full of skeptical private equity partners in downtown Chicago, leaning heavily on my cane but keeping my spine steel straight. "I am here to rescue your margins. The current system is actively bleeding your yields through operational inefficiencies masquerading as standard procedure. Fund my portfolio, and I will increase your net operating income by cutting the single largest, most unnecessary expense in commercial real estate, the cost of cruelty." Money, as it turns out, possesses absolutely zero loyalty. When they saw the math, the amusement faded from their eyes, replaced by the sharp, hungry gleam of predatory capitalists smelling blood in the water. Within 3 months, Vanguard Haven had secured its first $50 million in seed capital. The moment the ink was dry on our first major acquisition, a portfolio of distressed mid-rise apartment buildings in working-class neighborhood, I instituted a radical overhaul of the operational playbook. We completely dismantled the automated machine that Julian had championed and replaced it with a system designed around human intervention. I established a single unbreakable rule that overrode every other policy in our corporate handbook. Before any eviction filing could ever be submitted to the courts, 3 strict conditions had to be met. First, our management team was required to make a minimum of 3 direct, in-person contact attempts with the struggling tenant. I forbade the use of automated text messages or sterile, threatening emails. I demanded that a living, breathing human being knock on the door and simply ask the resident what had happened. Second, we implemented a mandatory, free financial counseling session offered to every single tenant who fell behind on their rent. We weren't there to scold them. We were there to help them restructure their debts or connect them with emergency rental assistance programs. Third, I instituted a mandatory 30-day review period overseen by a dedicated tenant advocate. This person was not a lawyer representing the company, nor were they a property manager worried about monthly quotas. Their sole job was to represent the renter and assess whether their financial hardship was a temporary stumble or a permanent inability to pay. Furthermore, for tenants who could demonstrate a sudden catastrophic loss of income, such as a layoff letter or a devastating medical bill, we created an emergency hardship fund that granted a 90-day grace period. No late fees, no penalties, no eviction proceedings, just time to breathe and recover. The old guard of the Chicago real estate scene laughed at us. Whispers circulated at country clubs and industry galas that Julian Vance's ex-wife was running a glorified homeless shelter and that Vanguard Haven would be bankrupt within the fiscal year. Julian himself, I was told, had smirked when he heard about my new venture, dismissing it as the emotional overcorrection of a scorned, sickly woman. But the numbers didn't laugh. 6 months into our operational launch, the data returned, and it was nothing short of revolutionary. Across the Vanguard Haven portfolio, our eviction filings had virtually ceased to exist. Our tenant retention rates skyrocketed past industry averages. And the true victory lay in the hidden column of the ledger. The catastrophic costs of turnover, the constant renovations between tenants, the bloated legal fees, the court filings, the lost rent during long vacancies, and the endless advertising for new renters. All of that dropped by exactly 41%. The mathematics of our success were absolute and undeniable. Keeping people in their homes was significantly cheaper than throwing them out. My thesis was proven. We were generating higher cash-on-cash returns than Julian's flagship funds, by squeezing our tenants tighter, but by giving them the grace to stand back up. With the proof of concept established, our silent expansion began. It was a masterfully orchestrated stealth campaign. Evelyn utilized her introduction to quietly approach the institutional investors, pension funds, and foreign wealth managers who had parked their billions in Julian's holding company. She invited them to quiet, candlelit dinners at private clubs, casually leaving our quarterly earnings reports on the table. As Vanguard Haven quietly acquired more properties, expanding our footprint across the Midwest, a profound shift began to occur in the market. Tenants actively sought out our buildings. Word of mouth in working-class neighborhoods is a powerful currency. When people realized that living in the Vanguard Haven building meant you wouldn't be thrown onto the winter sidewalk if you lost a shift at the hospital, our waitlists grew to thousands. We operated at near 100% occupancy. Meanwhile, Julian's empire was beginning to feel the strain. His aggressive eviction policies, which had once looked like a streamlined machine, were now buckling under the weight of an overloaded housing court system and a shifting public relations landscape. His legal fees were astronomical. His vacancy rates were creeping upward as tenants fled to properties that offered them basic human dignity. The very system he had relied upon to maximize his wealth was now quietly suffocating his margins. I watched it all happen from my new office, a beautiful, appointed, warm space that felt entirely different from the cold glass tomb I had once shared with him. I wasn't just managing a company anymore. I was commanding a fleet. I was steadily siphoning the lifeblood of Julian's empire, drawing his most lucrative investors away with the irresistible lure of stable, ethical, and massively profitable returns. He was bleeding out, and he was too arrogant to even realize someone had cut the artery. The trap was fully set. The board was positioned. Julian Vance thought he had eradicated a burden, but all he had done was hand me the exact tools I needed to build a guillotine. Compassion is not a weakness. In the brutal arena of business, it is a weapon of mass destruction when deployed correctly against a man who only understands greed. Vanguard Haven had proven that decency is profitable, but the real test was yet to come. Don't miss the next chapter, because the silent expansion is over, and the predator is finally about to become the prey. In my 5 decades on this earth, I have learned one absolute truth about men who build their fortunes on the broken backs of others. They never look down until the ground is already giving way beneath their feet. Building an empire on human misery is a lot like building a mansion on a sinkhole. You might enjoy the lavish view for years, but eventually the earth reclaims what it is owed. While Vanguard Haven was quietly cementing its stronghold as a profitable, ethical powerhouse in the real estate sector, Julian's $2.6 billion automated machine began to aggressively eat itself alive. His system was functioning exactly as he had designed it. Ruthless, uncompromising, and blindingly fast. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the era he was operating in. Cruelty in the dark is a tragedy. Cruelty in the glaring light of the digital age is a corporate liability. The catalyst for his public unraveling arrived on a freezing February evening, exactly 1 year after he had thrown me out onto the street. It didn't start in a boardroom. It started on a local Philadelphia news broadcast. A breaking news segment captured a scene that was terrifyingly familiar to me. A young, single mother, a certified nursing assistant, standing on a frozen sidewalk, surrounded by black garbage bags splitting at the seams. Her 2 young children were sitting on the pile of their worldly possessions, the youngest boy innocently asking his mother if they were camping. The investigative reporter laid out the damning facts with surgical precision. The mother had lived in that unit, which was part of Julian's massive portfolio, and had paid her rent perfectly on time for 58 consecutive months. Then, she lost her job during a round of hospital budget cuts. She had called Julian's third-party property management company 11 times asking for an extension, but nobody ever returned her calls. Within just 6 weeks of her first missed payment, the automated system had thrown her and her children into the freezing winter air. The broadcast went viral overnight. For Julian, a man who had proudly spent his 20-year career insulating himself from the human consequences of business to ensure he never had to look a renter in the eye, the sudden blinding spotlight of public outrage was a catastrophe. Wall Street and institutional investors generally have a high tolerance for moral ambiguity, but they have absolutely zero tolerance for bad press that threatens their bottom line. The media firestorm emboldened local politicians and housing advocacy groups. Suddenly, Julian's efficient eviction machine hit a massive grinding bottleneck. Pro bono attorneys began swarming housing courts, representing the very tenants Julian was trying to hastily remove. When a tenant has legal representation, the speed of an eviction grinds to a halt. I watched the financial fallout from the serene comfort of my Vanguard Haven corner office, a cup of hot chamomile tea soothing the lingering ache in my joints. I knew Julian's margins better than I knew the lines on my own face. When his automated evictions were challenged in court, his legal fees, spearheaded by the exorbitant billing rates of his attack dog Silas Croft, skyrocketed. Units that were supposed to be quickly turned over and relisted at market rate sat empty and entangled in litigation for months. Julian's revenue took an immediate, sharp dip, but it was the hidden costs of his arrogance. The prolonged vacancies, the legal defenses, the emergency public relations firms he hired to spin the narrative that absolutely vaporized his profit margins. His quarterly earnings report was a bloodbath. The 14,000-door empire was hemorrhaging cash. Panic is a highly contagious disease in the financial sector. The institutional investors, pension funds, and private equity firms that had long tolerated Julian's abrasive arrogance so long as the checks cleared, suddenly began looking for the exit. They wanted stability. They wanted reliable yields without the threat of congressional subpoenas or boycotts. And right there, standing quietly in the shadows with open arms and pristine, ethical ledgers, was Vanguard Haven. "It's time," I told Evelyn Rossi one brisk Tuesday morning. We were standing in front of a sprawling whiteboard in our war room, tracking the plummeting stock price of Julian's holding company. "The wolves are circling his sled. Let's make sure we're the ones driving it. If I was the architect of this grand retribution, Evelyn was the master assassin." We didn't march through the front door of Wall Street waving a flag. We slipped in through the plumbing. We launched the hunt. Using the substantial capital reserves we had amassed at Vanguard Haven, Evelyn and I constructed an intricate, untraceable labyrinth of corporate shell companies. We registered obscure LLCs in Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, giving them aggressively bland names like Apex Horizon Capital and Meridian Yield Partners. To the naked eye of any regulatory agency or corporate auditor, they were simply independent mid-tier investment firms capitalizing on a market dip. Nobody looking at those filings would ever connect them to the chronically ill, discarded black woman Julian had erased from his life a year prior. Through these toxic entities, we began to feast on his rotting empire. We started by aggressively buying up his distressed corporate debt for pennies on the dollar. Every time Julian's company needed a short-term cash injection to cover Silas Croft's mounting legal bills or to pacify an angry vendor, one of our shell companies was there, quietly acting as the lender of last resort. We were wrapping our hands around his throat, and he was thanking us for the oxygen. Then, we moved on to the equity. As Julian's stock price continued to slide amid the ongoing media circus and tenant strikes, the weaker shareholders panicked. Evelyn, utilizing her deep historical ties within the Chicago financial district, began making quiet, off-the-record phone calls. She met with skittish board members and nervous portfolio managers over scotch in dimly lit private clubs, gently whispering just enough poison about Julian's erratic leadership to accelerate the sell-off. "Julian Vance is a sinking ship," she would murmur, tracing the rim of her glass. "Cut your losses now before his ego drags your entire fund to the bottom of Lake Michigan." And they listened. Every time a major institutional investor dumped a block of shares, our shell companies were positioned directly underneath, quietly catching them. We accumulated 5%, then 12%, then 25% of the voting shares. We moved with the terrifying, silent precision of a predator stalking a wounded animal in tall grass. The most poetic, deeply satisfying irony of the entire operation was Julian's absolute blindness. Arrogant men only ever look up. They are too obsessed with protecting their crowns to check the floorboards. Julian was completely consumed by the raging fires above ground. He was spending his days screaming at publicists, berating Silas Croft, and frantically trying to appease the few board members who hadn't yet fled. He was fighting a desperate war for public perception. He never once bothered to look down at the foundation. He never realized that the system he had paid millions of dollars to build, the system designed to turn human beings into line items and erase them when they stopped performing, was the exact weapon I was using to dismantle him. Late one Thursday evening, Evelyn walked into my office. The city lights of Chicago glowed behind her like a conquered kingdom. She didn't say a word. She just walked over to my mahogany desk and slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the surface. I opened it. Inside was the consolidated capitalization table of Julian Vance's holding company, cross-referenced with the holdings of our various shell LLCs. I ran my manicured finger down the final column, my heart executing a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I looked up at Evelyn. The fierce, knowing smile on her face mirrored the ice-cold satisfaction in my own veins. Through our proxies, Vanguard Haven had just acquired 51% of the voting shares. The hunt was over. The trap had violently, irreversibly snapped shut. I now owned the very man who had called me a negative yield investment. I owned his 14,000 doors. I owned his legacy. Slowly closed the leather portfolio. I picked up my silver-handled cane. The illness that Julian thought would bury me merely forced me to sit still long enough to learn how to play the game better than he ever could. "Call Silas Croft," I said to Evelyn, my voice smooth as aged bourbon. "Tell him the majority shareholder is calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors for tomorrow morning." And Evelyn, "Yes, tell him the new owner prefers punctuality. There is a unique, intoxicating flavor to a vengeance that doesn't require a single drop of spilled blood, only the flawless execution of a corporate buyout. The board is set, the shares are counted, and Julian Vance is about to walk into a room he thinks he owns. If you want to witness the exact moment a billionaire's soul leaves his body, keep reading. The final execution is about to begin. The morning of the board meeting, Chicago was wrapped in a biting, unforgiving frost, the kind of cold that turns the sky the color of bruised iron. But inside the plush, leather-upholstered interior of my chauffeured town car, I felt nothing but a radiating, absolute warmth. I spent 2 full hours preparing my armor. When you are about to dismantle a man's entire reality, you do not simply show up, you arrive. I wore a bespoke tailored suit in a deep, commanding shade of midnight blue. The kind of cut that whispers of old money and unquestionable authority. My hair was impeccably styled, and the lupus flare-ups that had once ravaged my body were entirely in remission, thanks to the world-class medical care I could now easily afford. I still carried my silver-handled cane, but I no longer leaned on it for survival. Today, it was an accessory of power. A scepter. The emergency meeting was held on the top floor of the glass tower on Lakeshore Drive, the very same building that housed the sprawling penthouse I had once called home. The same building Julian had so casually banished me from when he decided I was no longer a performing asset. As Evelyn Rossi and I rode the private executive elevator up to the boardroom, the silence between us was electric. We didn't need to speak. The trap was sprung. All that was left was the execution. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom were closed, but the tension seeping from underneath them was palpable. Inside, the remaining board of directors of Foster Meridian Properties sat around a massive, polished mahogany table. At the head of that table stood Julian Vance. Through the glass, I watched him for a moment before making my entrance. He looked exhausted. The arrogant, untouchable sheen he had worn for the 20 years of his career was gone, replaced by the frantic, sweaty desperation of a cornered animal. He was standing at the podium, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles were white, delivering a frantic presentation.
He was desperately trying to convince the room that the media firestorm was a temporary setback,
that he could stabilize the massive portfolio of 14,000 rental units, and that the $2.6 billion empire he had built was still fundamentally sound. Sitting directly to his right was his attack dog, Silas Croft. Silas had a laptop open, his eyes darting across the screen, oblivious to the fact that the financial ground beneath his expensive Italian loafers had already collapsed. We just need to tighten the operational margins. Julian's muffled voice bled through the glass, pleading with men who were already looking at him like a corpse. We trim the administrative overhead, initiate a new public relations campaign to soften the brand, and we double down on the market rate relistings. The system still works. The system is efficient. I looked at Evelyn. She gave me a slow, predatory nod. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. The heavy clack of my silver-handled cane against the marble floor rang through the boardroom like a gunshot in a quiet church. The entire room froze. 14 heads turned simultaneously. Julian stopped mid-sentence. His mouth hung open. The color drained from his face so rapidly I actually thought he might pass out. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at the sick, broken black woman he had thrown onto a frozen sidewalk with nothing but black garbage bags, fully expecting her to quietly die in a shelter. Instead, I was standing in his sanctuary, radiating health, wealth, and an aura of absolute, unmitigated destruction. "Julian," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and echoing in the cavernous room. I didn't raise my tone. True power never has to shout. "You were speaking about the system's efficiency. Please, don't let me interrupt." "What is she doing here?" Julian stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards stationed near the elevators. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Silas, get her out of here. She has no security clearance. Have her removed immediately." Silas Croft stood up, his face flushed with indignation. "Mrs. Vance, this is a closed executive session. You are trespassing. If you do not leave this instant, I will have you arrested." I didn't move. I simply smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that caused the older board members to shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "It's Ms. Rossi who has the floor," I said softly, stepping aside just enough to let Evelyn step fully into the light. When Silas saw Evelyn, a woman he had personally blacklisted and humiliated 4 years ago, the indignation on his face instantly curdled into sheer terror. He looked down at his laptop, an incoming high-priority email flashing on his screen from the SEC. "Silas," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with venomous delight, "I strongly suggest you check the updated capitalization table that was just filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission 10 minutes ago. Specifically, the disclosures regarding the parent ownership of Apex Horizon Capital and Meridian Yield Partners." The room descended into a suffocating, breathless silence. The only sound was the frantic clicking of Silas Croft's mouse. I watched the arrogant, ruthless lawyer read the screen. I watched his eyes widen in horror. I watched his hands begin to visibly shake. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. "Silas?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "Silas, what is it? Throw them out." Silas slowly looked up from the screen. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw total, absolute surrender. "Julian," Silas whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "The shell companies. The ones that bought the distressed debt and caught the institutional sell-offs over the last 48 hours. What about them? Julian screamed. They are wholly owned subsidiaries of Vanguard Haven. Silence choked out, the air leaving his lungs. Julian, she owns it. She owns 51% of the voting shares. She is the majority shareholder of this company. A collective gasp rippled around the mahogany table. The wealthy, powerful men in the room suddenly realized that the king was dead, and the queen had just locked the doors. Julian stumbled backward, hitting the whiteboard behind him. No, he breathed, shaking his head. No, that's impossible. You didn't have a dime. I froze your accounts. I took everything. You're a burden? I offered, stepping deeper into the room. I walked slowly toward the head of the table. The board members practically shrank away from me, parting like the Red Sea. I stopped just 3 feet away from my ex-husband. Up close, I could smell sour air stench of his fear. You spent your entire life believing that sentiment is a luxury landlords can't afford, I said quietly, throwing his father's toxic philosophy right back into his face. You believed that the moment you saw a human being as a person instead of a contract, you had already lost. You built a machine designed to turn families into line items on a spreadsheet, and you erased them the second the numbers stopped performing. I leaned in closer, my eyes locking onto his terrified, shrinking gaze. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation, Julian. You forgot that I knew the math too. Your cruelty wasn't just evil, it was incredibly expensive. I didn't steal your empire from you. I simply picked up the pieces of the margins you threw away every time you threw a family onto the street. Your system is functioning exactly as it was designed to. It is currently eliminating the weakest, most inefficient liability in its portfolio. Please, Julian whispered, a pathetic broken sound escaping his throat. The great billionaire reduced to begging in front of the very board he used to terrorize. Please, we can make a deal. I built this. This is my life. You can't do this. I am simply reviewing the balance sheet, I replied, my voice turning to absolute ice. I stood up straight, projecting my voice so every single man in that room heard my final verdict. A year ago you looked at me, your sick, vulnerable wife, and you told me that I was a negative yield investment. You told me that you do not keep things that no longer generate value. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy and suffocating in the air. Well, Julian? Looking at the catastrophic financial ruin you've brought upon this holding company, it is the assessment of the majority shareholder that you are currently a massive bleeding liability. I drove the rubber tip of my cane into the carpet with a final echoing thud. You are a negative yield investment, Julian. You are fired. Get out of my building. There is a moment when a person's entire identity shatters, and watching it happen to a man who believed he was a god is a profound, unparalleled satisfaction. The boardroom doors have closed, but the real work of redemption is just beginning. If this confrontation gave you chills, make sure you subscribe and share this story. You won't want to miss the final chapter, where we sweep up the broken glass and turn a ruthless empire into a sanctuary. The silence that followed my declaration in the boardroom was the most exquisite sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of an empire changing hands. Julian did not leave with dignity. Arrogant men rarely do when their bluff is finally called. He argued. He practically wept, but the board members, who now answered directly to my 51% majority, turned their backs on him. They signaled for the executive security team. I stood perfectly still, resting both hands on the silver handle of my cane, and watched as the very guards Julian had hired to keep undesirables out of his glass tower firmly gripped him by the arms. As they marched him toward the frosted glass doors, Julian looked back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. He was being excised from his own life, forcefully escorted out of the building and onto the freezing concrete of Lakeshore Drive, stripped of his title, his power, and his untouchable status. He was about to learn exactly how cold the sidewalk feels when the system decides you no longer have value. Once the doors clicked shut behind him, I didn't waste a single second celebrating. There was a catastrophic amount of bleeding to stop. I walked over to the head of the mahogany table, taking the seat that had been occupied by a tyrant for 2 decades. Evelyn sat to my right, opening her laptop. I looked at the remaining executives in the room. Effective immediately, Vanguard has absorbed Foster Meridian Properties, I announced, my voice giving absolutely no room for debate. We now control a portfolio of 14,000 residential units across 6 major cities, and as of this exact second, the old operational handbook is dead. My first official directive as the undisputed CEO was swift and absolute. I ordered an immediate portfolio-wide freeze on every single pending eviction. I mandated that not one more family would be put on the street by our company until every case had been personally reviewed by a human being. I ordered the IT department to permanently dismantle the automated eviction software. We completely severed ties with the third-party property management firms that had acted as Julian's blind executioners. In their place, we deployed Vanguard Haven's army of tenant advocates. We reached out to the mothers who were weeks away from losing their homes and offered them grace periods. We instituted the emergency hardship funds, ensuring that a sudden layoff or a medical emergency wouldn't equate to a death sentence for a family's stability. We brought in counselors, we repaired the broken heating systems, and we replaced the decaying locks on the doors. Unlike Julian, who had spent 20 years boasting that he had never walked the hallway of a building he owned, I made it my mission to visit them. I walked through the brick mid-rises in Philadelphia and the aging apartment complexes in Chicago. I sat in community rooms and looked into the faces of the people who funded my empire. I saw single mothers going off to their night shifts at the hospital without the suffocating terror of finding their belongings in garbage bags on the curb. I saw little girls doing their homework at real desks instead of hiding crackers in their backpacks. I saw 5-year-old boys who finally understood that they were home, and not just camping. We proved on a massive national scale that a real estate empire could generate billions of dollars without demanding a blood sacrifice from the working class. It has been 2 years since that morning in the boardroom. The systemic overhaul was grueling, but today our profit margins are higher than Julian ever achieved. More importantly, the soul of the company has been resurrected. Late last night, I found myself standing alone in the Lakeshore Drive penthouse. I had reclaimed it not to live in. It was far too cold and cavernous for my taste, but to finally strip it of Julian's ghosts before selling it. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, glittering grid of the city, and then down at the dark, endless expanse of Lake Michigan. I thought about the terrifying afternoon I first received my diagnosis. I thought about the searing, agonizing pain in my joints, and the unimaginable cruelty of a husband who looked at my failing health and called me a burden, a negative yield investment. He had tried to bury me. He had used his vast wealth, his ruthless lawyers, and his automated machine to erase a sick, vulnerable black woman from his pristine world. He expected me to quietly fade away into the statistics of the broken and the forgotten. But he forgot one crucial detail: I am a builder. My autoimmune disease did not kill me. It merely slowed me down long enough to see the cracks in the world. Julian's cruelty did not crush me. It forged me into something unbreakable. I didn't just survive the darkest, coldest season of my life. I weaponized my survival. I took the stones he threw at me and built an empire that eclipsed his wildest dreams. I turned away from the glass and walked out of the penthouse, my cane tapping a steady, victorious rhythm on the Italian marble floor. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a statistic. I was the architect of a new era. If you've made it to the end of this journey, thank you. This story is a testament to the fact that your lowest moment is not your final chapter. If someone has ever told you that you are worthless, or if a broken system has ever tried to erase you, remember this: they only have the power you surrender to them. Stand up, learn the rules, and rewrite the game. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this conclusion. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own power, and never ever let anyone else hold the pen to your life.